Hi class, today we are going to study chapter 24, section 1, Greece's war with Persia from the story of the world. This war is also known as the Greco-Persian War or just the Persian Wars. In this video, we are going to review chapter 24.1. We're going to review Greece and Persia very briefly and just talk about where Greece and Persia are at right before the world war begins. And then we're going to study the Persian Wars, an introduction, and then talk about how did the war begin exactly, and then the war begins, and then the different battles, Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea, and then the results of the Greco-Persian Wars. So let's start with your chapter 24.1 review. So in this section, you read about how the only commonalities between Athens and Sparta were their language and their gods. In the last few videos, when we studied the Athenians and the Spartans, like you guys know that they were just really different in how they viewed the world and what they valued. And so these differences led them to fight each other often. During this time, Persia had conquered all of the surrounding areas except for Greece, and I'll show you a picture a little bit later, but they wanted Greece. So they first sent messengers to ask them, please be part of our empire, and the Greeks were furious and they refused because you know that the Greeks were very independent, like their cities were very independent. They didn't even want Greece as a whole to be unified, to be under one leader. Like they would never want to be under a Persian empire. So when it didn't work for the Persians to send envoys and to ask this, the Persians were like, well, we're just going to attack. So then war begins around 500 BC, and Athens and Sparta, despite their differences, become allies to fight the Persians. The Battle of Marathon is one of the most famous battles of the war and in war battles in general. It was the Persians versus the Athenians, and the Athenians won this victory. There was a man who ran 26 miles to reach Athens with the news that they had been victorious, and this is the origin of the marathon. The Battle of Salamis occurred in 480 BC. This was a great sea battle, and the Greeks defeated the Persians. And in your chapter, it talks about how then the Persians went home, but there's one other battle snuck in there, and we will discuss that later on. But the Greek cities remained independent from the Persians because of their victory in the Greco-Persian Wars. So let's review Greece and Persia just for a minute. So Greece, we learned about the Minoans who lived on the island of Crete, and then there was a volcanic eruption probably, and they declined. Mycenaeans were on the mainland. They conquered the Minoans eventually. They flourished for a while. They're the ones that fight the Trojan. They're the ones where we have the legends of the Trojan War, where the Iliad and the Odyssey come from. However, the Sea People, the Dorians, attack. You have the Bronze Age collapse, and Greece is plunged into the Greek Dark Ages. Eventually, they come out of that, and this is where you have the archaic period of Greece, where you have Homer writing down these stories from the Trojan War. You have the alphabet developed, the Olympics begins, and you have the development and the creation of the polis, which is the Greek city-state. In Persia, you had King Astyages, who was the Median king who controlled Persia. He tried to kill his grandson Cyrus, and Cyrus was a Persian because his dad was a Persian. Cyrus rises up with the Persians and overthrows King Astyages. He becomes the king of the Medes and the Persians, and he conquers all the surrounding territory except for Greece. And when he dies, King Darius becomes king, and you guys know Darius from the famous Bible story, Daniel and the Lion's Den. So here's a map of the Persian Empire during this time, and I just want you to see the extent. They've gone to Egypt. Here's Babylon. Here's Persia originally. Here's Media. They even go to the Indus River, all this region, and you read about Lydia right here. This will be important in a minute, and how King Cyrus conquers King Croesus of Lydia. So they have all this area, but they don't have Greece. So I'm going to give you an introduction of the Persian Wars. So here's just an overview. So the Persian Wars were a conflict between, you guys know, the Persians and the Greeks. It happens in two invasions, one in 490, one in 480 BC. The one in 490 is done by King Darius. The one in 480 is done by King Xerxes. Many of the most famous battles in history were fought during the Persian Wars, Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis being some of those. I want to share this quote with you because I think it's so interesting of the difference in perspective of how important the Persian wars were from the Greek perspective and how unimportant they were from the Persian perspective. So Susan Wise Bauer says, the war between the Persians and the Greeks, which trailed on for a little more than 20 years, receives barely a mention in Persian histories. But in Greece, it was the center of every man's life and at the edge of every woman's for over 2 decades. Our accounts are all from Greeks. Herodotus, who was 5 years old when the war ended, but who interviewed eyewitnesses to reconstruct the events. Thucydides, born 20 or so years later, who made use of Herodotus's accounts but corrected some of his interpretations based on other sources. And the Greek playwright Aeschylus, who was older than both the historians and fought in the war himself. His plays, The Persians, is the work of an eyewitness, but its spotlight is on Greek courage, not campaigns. In the eyes of these men, the battles of the Persian Wars are central to the development of humanity. From the Persian point of view, they were small engagements which, when they went badly, were best ignored. So, like, don't you guys think that's so interesting? The Persians are like, oh yeah, we went to fight and try to get Greece. 20 years, didn't work, and like they barely even talk about it. But for Greece, whose homeland was invaded, whose independence and freedom was threatened, and against all odds were able to defeat the Persians, like the statement where she says the battles of the Persian Wars are central to the development of humanity, like not just their country, but they believed it was central to the development of humanity, like all of it. And that is profound. So for the Greeks, these wars were so significant. And for the Persians, they're not even mentioned hardly at all in their histories. So let's talk about how the war began. And for that, we're going to talk about the Ionian Revolt. So do you guys remember, I just mentioned it, so I hope you remember, but Cyrus had conquered King Croesus in Lydia, which is this area right here. And Persia controlled that entire region, including Ionia, which was a region with Greek cities. So along this coastline, you just had, I know that the drawing, the circle is not accurate, so just forgive me, but there were Greek cities in this area. And they were under Persian rule. So a revolt happens where around 500 BC, the Ionians declared independence from the Persians. They were like, we're Greek, enough of this, Persians, we're not listening to you guys anymore. We're not paying taxes and tribute to you anymore. And so Athens, which I'm going to show you a bigger map of this later, but Athens is right here, and sorry, Eretria is right there. And these two Greek cities say, hey, we're going to come and help you with this revolt. King Darius is like, no you don't. So he sends an army at once to stop this revolt. So what happens? So the Ionians are able, actually, with the help of Athens and Eretria, to capture and burn down Sardis, right here, which was a Persian city. Oh man, the Persians were not happy about this, and eventually, the rebellion grew enough that the fighting lasted in a stalemate for several years. So it starts at 500, and then finally in 494 BC, a huge fleet of Persian ships came and just completely crushed this rebellion. They were like, enough is enough. You guys are under our rule. Just stop. And unfortunately, like this is sad to me, Susan Wise Bauer says most of the male population was killed. And she's quoting Herodotus. So Herodotus said, "Their women and children reduced to slavery. Those who remained alive were taken to Susa." So these Greek cities under Persian rule had revolted. Athens and Eretria had come to help burn down a Greek Persian city, and the Persians send a bunch of ships and just destroy them. So then after this, the actual war begins with Darius attacking. So what were his motives for attacking? Well, first, Darius had sent, like you read about, envoys to Greece telling them you need to submit to Persian rule, like be a part of our Persian Empire. And we talked about how the Greeks were so fiercely independent, they didn't even want one Greek leader, let alone be under the Persian Empire. This idea was just so terrifying to them. And so they executed the envoys. The Spartans even pushed them down this large well that they had in their city. And so even though the Athenians and the Spartans were very different and they did not get along, they were like, hey, if the Persians attack, let's be allies. So they formed an alliance. So that's one of the reasons Darius attacks, because they executed their envoys and they wouldn't submit to him. Also, Darius remembered how Athens and Eretria had helped during the Ionian Revolt and how burned down Sardis. And so he kind of wanted to get back at them. So his first try in 492 BC, so the revolt ends in 494, or 2 years later, he sent a land force and a naval force, so by sea and by land, to conquer the northern Greek cities. But this invasion fails because a storm came and destroyed most of his ships. And it took Darius almost 2 years to rebuild this. And so then in 490, he was ready to finally attack. So Darius comes with his fleet of ships, and after destroying an island city, he goes to Eretria, which you can see a little bit better on this map. It's right here, and he burns it down. Then, because, revenge, then he turns to Marathon, which is about 25 miles north of Athens. So here's Athens, and Marathon is right around here. The Athenians are in alliance with the Spartans, so they call to Athens for help. And the Spartans, the greatest soldiers in Greece, this is what everything is about in Sparta, is just creating these warriors. But they're having this religious festival, which didn't permit fighting during the festival, and so they wouldn't come, and they would end up missing the battle by 1 day. So this leads us to the Battle of Marathon, September 490 BC. So here's your overview. Again, September 490 BC, it was fought in the plains of Marathon right here, and it's fought between the Greeks and the Persians. And Mark Cartwright says the battle was a victory that will go down in folklore as the moment the Greek city-states showed the world their courage and excellence and won their liberty. So before we talk about the battle, I want to talk to you about both of the armies. The Greek army had soldiers who were called hoplites. And so there were 9,000 Athenian hoplites and there were 1,000 Platanian. Plataea was another city, and we'll talk about it later. There were 1,000 Platanians, and so there were about 10,000 in all. And the Greek hoplites were trained to fight in a phalanx. Did I say that right? Phalanx formation, which was, I don't know a ton about it, but it was a very tight formation, and they were kind of put their shields overlapping each other, and they had these spears coming out, and they would use, again, spears and shields and swords. And you can see on this picture right here is a stele of the Greek phalanx. The Persian army came with 600 ships. Can you imagine seeing a fleet of 600 ships on your horizon? That would just be, that would be terrifying to me. And they came with 25,000 soldiers. So you have 10,000 Greeks and you have 25,000 Persians. And the Persian army was really good at long-range archery, and they had lightweight arrows. So the Battle of Marathon began September 11th, 490 BC. Both armies lined up, and the Persians were lined up maybe 10 men deep. That just means like their line had like a lines of 10 men, and the Greeks did not have that many men. So instead of forming in their usual formations like this, they spread out so that they could match the length of the Persians. And this was so that the Persians mostly wouldn't be able to get around them, because if the Greeks were like in a tight formation and the Persians were like up over here, like they could easily get around them and they would have to fight on two different fronts. So because I'm not really good at describing battles and war, I'm going to read you some descriptions. So Radu Christian from Ancient History Encyclopedia says, the two opposing armies met on the field of Marathon in 490 BCE. The Persian army, though heavily outnumbering the Greek armies, was slow and overconfident. Like, it is never good to be overconfident. Especially I would think in war. The Greeks took advantage of the situation as the two armies approached each other at a casual pace. So they're just like going, and then the Greeks took advantage of this situation. Oh wait, I already read that, sorry. As the two armies approached each other at a casual pace, the Greeks suddenly broke into a sprint. This caught the Persians off guard, and before they knew it, they were forced to battle in full hand-to-hand combat. After a few hours of battle, the Persian ranks broke, many of them running toward the safety of the ships or the nearby mountains. 6,000 Persians fell, while the Greek army lost only 200 men. The marble blocks which the Persians intended to use for the monument they were going to erect after the battle was instead used by the victorious Greeks to build a monument for their fallen comrades. This blow was seen as an insult by Darius, who chose to fight on and prepared for another invasion. This plan, however, never came to fruition due to his death in 486 BCE. One more description. The Persian tactic of rapidly firing vast numbers of arrows into the enemy must have been an awesome sight, but the lightness of the arrows meant that they were largely ineffective against the bronze-armored hoplites. At close quarters, the Greeks thinned their center and extended their flanks to envelope the enemy lines, like we talked about. This and their long spears, heavy swords, better armor, and rigid discipline of the phalanx formation meant that the Greek hoplites won a great victory against the odds. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet fled back to Asia, but they would be back, and next time in even bigger numbers. So isn't that crazy? You have only 10,000 Greeks and 25,000 Persians, but they're all just like, oh, we're going to fight a war, and you have the Persians firing all these arrows, and the Greeks are like, we're not going to take this, and they just run. And if you're running, and the Persians are really good at long range, like archery, and and it's not doing anything against like their shields all like in a tight formation and their bronze armor and helmets and things like that. And yeah, like they just went and slaughtered them. Like I just think this is crazy. If you want more information, this is an optional video, but I know some of you love wars and battles. If you want more information about the Battle of Marathon, go watch this video. It's really good and will give you a lot more detail than I did. That leads to the Battle of Thermopylae, and this is happening 10 years later. So the Greeks were defeated the Persians at Marathon, and they had, you know, a relative time of quiet for 10 years. But in 486, Xerxes I became king after Darius died. So King Xerxes was like, I'm going to go get those Greeks. And he gathered a huge force to invade Greece. He set out August 480 BC with 150,000 soldiers. Like, that would be a force to be reckoned with. When the Greek city-states heard about the fact that the Persians were coming, they sent 6,000 to 7,000 men to defend the pass at Thermopylae, and you'll see this later. But this included 300 Spartans, because the Spartans were celebrating their most important religious festival yet again, and only 300 of the 8,000 men they had available were able to make it, which I just think, I don't know. I understand saying like, this is what I believe and we're going to hold to it. But if you have like Persians attacking you, I don't know. Tell me what you think. You think this was like good, like that they held to what they believed, or should they have sent their 8,000 men? Anyway, I want you to go watch this because I can't make the visuals that this video does and showing you exactly kind of like what happens at the Battle of Thermopylae. And then I want you to write in your answers to the questions that I gave you for this video. Do that and come back. And that leads us to the Battle of Salamis, September 480 BC. So just a little bit later. So the Battle of Salamis was a naval battle in the Saronic Gulf. Again, September 480 BC. Mark Cartwright says, the Greek victories at Salamis is one of the greatest and most significant military victories in antiquity. Overcoming superior numbers with daring tactics and sheer determination, the allied Greek forces won a freedom which would allow a never-before-seen period of artistic and cultural endeavors, which would form the foundations of Western culture for a millennia. We'll talk about this quote a little bit later, or this idea a little bit later. But basically what he's saying is that Greeks winning this victory, this was a decisive battle. And because they were able to win this battle and then win the next one, it allowed Greece to enter into a period of just creating things never seen before. And this laid the groundwork for Western civilization. And the videos that you watched on Athens, like the famous Athenian video that I had you guys watch, all that happens after this, because that's in the classical period. So this is the end of the archaic period, and you enter into the classical period after the Persian Wars, and this is where you have like Athens and democracy and all those things develop. So I'm sorry things are out of chronological order. I just kind of went with the chapters of the book, but that's what he's saying. So after the Battle of Thermopylae, so the video you just watched about the 300 Spartans, the Persian victory allowed them to enter Greece. The Persians rampaged through the Greek city-states, and unfortunately, Athens was sacked during this time, and Athens came under Persian control. Meanwhile, 30 city-states prepared to fight. Here is, again, a description of the battle, because I'm not good at describing things like wars. In September 480 BCE at Salamis in the Saronic Gulf, the Greeks once more faced a larger enemy force. The exact numbers are much disputed, but the figure of 500 Persian ships against a Greek fleet of 300 seems the most likely estimate. The Hoplites, so the Greek army, had won at Marathon. Now it was the turn of the trireme, the Greek boats, to take center stage. The fast and maneuverable Greek warships powered by 3 banks of oars and armed with a bronze ram. The Persians also had triremes, but the Greeks had an ace up their sleeve, the great Athenian general Themistocles. He, with 20 years of experience and the confidence from his leadership at Artemisium, employed a bold plan to entice the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis and hit the enemy fleet so hard it had nowhere to retreat. By 480, the Persian king Xerxes and his army had overrun much of Greece, and his navy of about 800 galleys bottled up the smaller Greek fleet of about 370 triremes in the Saronic Gulf. So this is another description, so their numbers are a little different, but the Greek commander Themistocles then lured the Persian fleet into the narrow waters of the Strait of Salamis, and I'll show you a map in a second, where the massed Persian ships had difficulty maneuvering. The Greek triremes then attacked furiously, ramming or sinking many Persian vessels and boarding others. The Greeks sank about 300 Persian vessels while losing only about 40 of their own. The rest of the Persian fleet was scattered, and as a result, Xerxes had to postpone his planned land offensive for a year, a delay that gave the Greek city-states time to unite against him. The Battle of Salamis was the first great naval battle recorded in history. So here is, I already circled it, but the map, the little area called Salamis. And this is where Themistocles led the Persians so that the big Persian ships couldn't maneuver well, and they attacked them and destroyed them. Here's a picture someone drew depicting this battle. Here's a picture of a Greek trireme ramming into a Persian ship and sinking it. And that leads us to the Battle of Plataea, August 479 BC. So even though the Greeks had won at Salamis, and this was like a very decisive victory, the Persians remained in control of those cities that they had rampaged earlier on. The Greece and Persia like negotiated, tried to figure things out, but it didn't do anything. So the two armies met at Plataea, which is circled here, August of 479 BC. So the Battle of Plataea. So the armies, the Greeks had soldiers from 30 city-states and 110,000 soldiers. The Persians had similar numbers to the Greeks, but maybe more. We're not really sure. I'm not going to talk about this battle except to say the Greeks were victorious and the Persians left Greece. So the result of the Greco-Persian Wars was that this was a world-changing victory. Mark Cartwright says, the victory not only guaranteed Greece's freedom from foreign rule, but also permitted soon after an astonishingly rich period of artistic and cultural endeavors, which would lay the cultural foundations of all future Western civilizations. So because the Greeks won the Greco-Persian Wars, it allows them to enter into a time we know as a classical period. And this is where Athens, you have the building of the Parthenon, you have, Herodotus, the father of history, you have Hippocrates, like all those people that you studied. And this lays the foundation of Western civilization. And like that influence is still felt and very much alive today. So that is all I have for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.